All right, let's start. Great. Welcome everyone. I'm Tanishka Goswami from NLU Delhi Engage, and I thank you all for joining today's discussion on right in search of protection, privacy and data security in India. It's our honor to have with us Ms. Ujjwala Uppaluri and Mr. Apar Gupta today. Thank you for sparing time on a weekend to share your insights with us on a topic so significant. Um, with innovative technologies which make personal data easily accessible, how our data is collected, stored, used, and shared becomes extremely crucial. How should a legal framework for protecting an individual's right to privacy work in an age where economies are oiled by the very same data? In fact, how should we, as consumers and producers of data, deal with this social dilemma between compromising our privacy every time we use technology and enjoying the benefits that it offers? India's Personal Data Protection Bill 2019 is one such legal framework that has been criticized for strengthening the state's regulatory powers rather than safeguarding the fundamental right to privacy guaranteed by the Puttaswamy judgment. There are multiple concerns with respect to the Act's overburdening requirements of data localization, as well as the vast exemptions it grants to the state that makes us worry of whether or not we're approaching a surveillance state. In fact, as students learning to comprehend and analyze various legal and political developments, the debate on privacy as a right and search of protection is unmissable. In this slide, our speakers today shall address us on the multifarious aspects of the privacy debate in the country. Mr. Apar Gupta is currently the Executive Director of the Internet Freedom Foundation. He holds a master's from Columbia Law School and has been extensively involved in digital rights issues such as net neutrality, internet shutdowns, data privacy, and censorship. He was awarded the Ashoka Fellowship in 2020 for his contribution to digital rights advocacy in the country. Ms. Ujjwala Uppaluri practices before the Supreme Court India and is a fellow at the Center for Communication Governance at NLU Delhi. Having graduated from NUJS Kolkata, Ms. Uppaluri holds a master's from Harvard Law School. She has researched and written expansively on the interface of technology and the Constitution, as well as surveillance and censorship. Before we begin, I request the audience to note that questions can be put only in the Q&A box, and the chat box feature has been disabled for this webinar. And after the speaker's addresses, we'll try to ensure that all your questions are addressed. Over to you, Mr. Gupta.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and generous opportunity to talk to students at National Law University, Delhi. Several of our staffers and past interns come from law faculties at National Law University, Delhi, and its work on telecommunications surveillance as well as communication technologies through the Center for Communication Governance is deeply enriching our shared understanding of privacy and data protection. Taking this conversation forward, I would like to first set a historical example to demonstrate the tangibility of surveillance as well as important markers in the contemporary legal debate, then going towards what we can look towards the future. So when in 1984, the anti-Sikh riots were happening, there were lists of Sikhs which were circulated all across localities in Delhi with people who then subsequently attacked, robbed, and killed them. These lists were actually created due to a nature of the elections which are there for Gurudwaras under a state enactment by itself. Now, this culminated in several acts of violence and shows how information by itself impacts not only the privileged and elite, can have long-term consequences in political environments where the rule of law is often lacking. Information itself is not only power, it is sometimes oppression. And this is sometimes a historical burden for legal reform to factor in and to incrementally move towards a greater sense of justice. This brings us today to how information, especially which is digitized, is being gathered in larger amounts from our smartphone devices. It also brings us to this particular point in time in history as we look forward towards the future. And I know several of our colleagues who are joining us today, who are students at National Law University, are well aware of these circumstances. Our smartphone devices offer us a high degree of human function, potential, as well as ease. They offer us connections to our friends, families, to essential services, but at the back, they are, they are pervasively gathering points of our personal information which are quite outside our contemplation. Rather than focusing on data protection, in which this information may be consensually gathered from us under terms of contract, given that India today lacks a data protection law by itself, I will be focusing more of my comments towards surveillance, the condition under which government more often than private actors gathers and surveils people in getting their information without their notification, consent, or knowledge. And this is often done for reasons which are at a very high barrier, sometimes articulated for necessity of state security, integrity, or for public order by itself. Now, how do we contextualize this within the judgment of the Puttaswamy litigation, which is a bunch of two judgments, and what can we draw from that? And Ujjwala, who's been a part of that litigation, I hope can offer a greater context in her remarks. I hope that any mistakes that I made may be open to correction by her. Now, if you look at the Puttaswamy judgment by itself, the conventional understanding and reading by several lawyers, which have developed a level of consensus in their writing, has been to read the opinions of the judges together to evidence a majority in terms of the precedent, to evidence a binding value. And this is what law students as well as practicing lawyers will quite often yearn for, is to what is the ratio of this judgment? How do we apply it as precedent in future? And rather than going in the orbiter, which may offer insight, and I will refer to it in passing, quite often the consensus which I so just referred for evidencing this binding value of the precedent has been towards looking at a mix of Chandrachud, given that it is assented by about 4 judges, they've signed to it, and also looking towards one other judge, which sometimes happens to be called. And the reason behind this is there are principles of necessity and proportionality, which are contained within the last 3 pages in a clearer statement of under the heading conclusion by Justice Chandrachud. And also the necessary and proportionate principles are again then referred by Justice Kaur. So necessity and proportionality beyond the legality of the measure are 3 prongs which are sometimes utilized by academic legal scholars at present, with the hope that legal precedent assimilates them completely. Now, how does this interact with surveillance and the surveillance regime that we see at present? And here again, I would like to refer to the prior writing academically, which is there on these topics. And apologies if I'm missing several authors on these issues. But what has been influential to my own personal understanding has been writing not only by Ujjwala, who has written on this, but also by Brinda Bhandari and Chaitanya Ramachandran, who have published extensively, if not extensively in volume, but in terms of contribution towards legal thought on these issues. And it is my hope of people who are also listening to this lecture can develop this understanding in a much more contemporary context, as is being done by people such as, for instance, I think Shreya Tiwari has written on the implications of the Schrems judgment and what does it mean. today. So there are always ways to incrementally forward legal thought on these issues. Now, stepping back to precedent and tethering this lecture more towards how our legal regime towards surveillance is structured. It is contained within statutorily Section 5(2) of the Indian Telegraph Act and Section 69 of the Information Technology Act, which provide a legislative mandate to authorize interception, which is in favor of the central government and state governments. The process and procedure for this has evolved through a 1996 judgment reported in 1997 reports called the People's Union of Civil Liberties versus Union of India, which is called the telephone tapping judgment. This telephone tapping judgment is essentially an outcome of a litigation in which the court looks at the existing provisions and states that it lacks a process and procedure, thereby lacking reasonability. When there is a lack of process and procedure, the court so reasons that the reasonability itself is absent because it is open then towards arbitrary exercise of the legislative power. Now, do these in 2020 hold good as they held good in 1996? And this is something for us to consider, not only due to the march of technology, not only due to the growth of teleconnectivity, but also due to looking at it a bit more closely as to whether these safeguards has ever worked. So what are their design flaws by itself is something I will address in just a few moments. But before coming to it, what is this process and procedure? This process and procedure, after the PUCL judgment was given, is contained within Rule 419 of the Indian Telegraph Act, which has been amended over the course of time in 2007, latest in 2014, and you can see recent versions of it on the Department of Telecom's website. Interestingly, if you look at Section 5(2), it not only says that specific and individual surveillance is permitted, but also a class of messages can be intercepted, which is denominative that the class of messages, when it's not tethered to the identity of an individual, which may be any person, may also be any persons. So arguably, if there's a lack of judicial scrutiny and oversight, it may open up technical deployment of infrastructure within government for what is typified as mass surveillance, which is agnostic or is done over large bodies of people towards class of messages. And this is further evidenced when one looks at what's been happening with the standard operational procedure, which was made in 2011 and is filed in a litigation which is being presently pending before the Supreme Court. A minute before I come towards that. The rules under Section 5(2) of the Telegraph Act also have an accompanying cousin under the Information Technology Act, which are called the interception rules, which are made in 2009. Its powers are in fact much broader than Rule 419. For instance, it also includes within its definitional framework the power to redirect traffic and to remotely install software, thereby permitting state agencies who are authorized to act under these rules to essentially create, for instance, dummy website pages every time you may type in google.com to essentially query and trick you into providing your password by itself. The legality of Rule 419 as well as rules under the IT Act made in 2009 under Section 69 are to be tested. And this test is right now pending before the Supreme Court, as PUCL has gone last year again to the Supreme Court, close to 20 after 25 years. And it has essentially argued that the safeguards which were made in PUCL in 1996, in the 1997 judgment, are in fact outdated and are flawed with our contemporary understanding of privacy. especially which emanates from the Puttaswamy judgment. Now, the other petition in this, in which I am also associated, is the petition filed by the Internet Freedom Foundation itself, even though I don't serve as a lawyer on it, and it's authorized by another trustee and led by another legal team. Several lawyers are associated with that, including Brinda Bhandari as well, and many others. And the core understanding which is being taken forward there is essentially that if you look at the Puttaswamy judgment, it prescribes standards which are substantively incompatible with the 1996 holding of the Supreme Court. And thereby, the Supreme Court itself not only needs to revisit the operational framework of the process and procedure under Rules 419 or rules made in 2009 under the IT Act, but the substantive powers itself, and also lay down sufficient safeguards accounting for the change in technologies and the facility of governments economically and technically to conduct this form of surveillance. Quickly now pacing a bit on these issues, the present litigation indicates three core faults. The first is the lack of a legislative mandate for the authorized agencies which do conduct this surveillance, quite often which do not have any oversight by itself. For instance, the agencies who are accounting for our national security and indeed keeping us safe in several instances do lack a legislative oversight, do lack the proper creation of legislative frameworks, which in fact bound them within a rule of law framework. The second is the centralization of executive power. If you look at Rule 22 closely, within Sub-Rule 22 closely in Rule 419, it essentially centralizes the power of authorization, subsequently also review, and thereby there is no independent third party or state entity which is looking at how the authorization is done, when is it being done, are the conditions being matched, and is this actually being done in a manner which is not extraneous to the actually intended and limited nature of why state surveillance is permissible. Finally, there's a high element of secrecy. So legality, centralization of executive power, and secrecy are three core hallmarks. Quickly pivoting to the Puttaswamy judgment again, I would like to also refer to the obiter of Justice Nariman, who refers to the necessary and proportionate principles on surveillance in his opinion. And if you do look at the necessary and proportionate principles, and I would urge this because it does serve enduring value, and just contrast it, for instance, with the secrecy which is here, and why we also have this historic burden, and it's not unique to us in India. Please refer to page 35 of the commentary, where it does state quite clearly that unfortunately, although European law requires user notification in the context of data protection in general, the European Court of Human Rights has so far failed to find user notification and a necessary requirement in cases involving covert surveillance. And it first states the case of Klaas versus Germany, where it says it is desirable, and then says in a subsequent case in 2007, the court suggested that as soon as notification can be made without jeopardizing the purpose of surveillance after its termination, information should be provided to the persons concerned. So it's not only us who are facing a growth in surveillance with adoption on digital devices and a large amount of conversation around how should legal reform encounter and deal with it. Now, just quickly stepping towards the conclusion, I would like to state two things to provide a sense of hope, because there are young lawyers here who will possibly enrich the bar, enrich the benches, or work with grassroots groups providing actual legal aid and great value to what we are seeing in terms of collection of personal data, which threatens their daily activities and their political advocacy. Here, I would like to firstly mention the first actual political argument as documented in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's autobiography. It's called My Own Words, and it's actually a op-ed to the. It's a letter to the editor of the Cornell Daily Sun, and guess what? It's titled "Wiretapping: Cure Worse Than Disease." And I'm just reading out one para, and she's arguing against wiretapping, which is unlawful. She says that wiretapping may save the government investigators a good deal of time and effort by making it unnecessary to seek other sources of proof. A thorough investigation of cases may seem like a burdensome task, especially when the shortcut of wiretapping can achieve more immediate results. As an officer in India once said, comma, open quotes, it is far pleasanter to sit comfortably in the shade, rubbing red pepper into a poor devil's eyes than go out in the sun hunting the evidence, end quote. So with this, I'd like to say that it's not only us but it does speak poorly towards what it may be a general predominant impression people do carry about law enforcement in India. But we can improve this. And I think this is because we have completed 25 years of the internet. This is not optimism which is without reason. It is in the larger course of history, people who are much younger than me will engage with precedent and improve it. And on Independence Day, we did complete 25 years of the full rollout of internet for people in India, and reflecting on challenges in a past age in time, coming off fresh off a large-scale invasion in India by China, which we had to cede substantial territory in Tibet, or which was right before, 1 year before he passed away, Prime Minister Nehru on August 15th, 1963, his last Independence Day address stated that free India is still a child for what we are 16 years in the life of a country. And writing an op-ed in the Hindustan Times, I said that in a similar sentiment, even if we do not consider the internet a child, for this transformational technology is a quarter of a century, only marks an early teenage. We must be hopeful but honest to our constitutional vision as we look towards a digital India. So there is a historic burden of legal reform which must be shared by all of us. This will be incremental and will be going forward. Thank you so much. I look forward to Ujjwala's remarks as well and engaging with all of you in the question and answers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gupta, for sharing your insights and opinions. And there are so many questions that come to my mind, and I'm sure that the audience is actually posing questions, and they'll ask many more questions after Ujjwala ma'am's remarks. So I'll request her to take over from now.
Thanks, Tanishka. Thank you for having me, and thanks Apar for doing all of the difficult work as usual. I get to play in what the principle means and really what that constitutional vision you were speaking to towards the end of your remarks amounts to in light of Puttaswamy 1. I thought I might do this in two parts today. The first is that I wanted us to think through the question of what privacy is. And I noticed that there's already a question about definition. So it's neat that I'm able to address that in my remarks here. And once we've done that, once we've thought about what the right really is, what privacy is, and what it does in our constitutional framework, we can then perhaps look at how collecting and processing data can result in consequences which are constitutionally significant. Before Puttaswamy, we didn't really have the language in which to do this, though of course we were all agreed on the petitioner side in that case that the right did in fact exist. So to that constitutional vision really, I think that privacy and thinking about privacy really calls on us to think about a whole constellation of values that are at the foundation of the way we see ourselves as Indians, for our conceptions of citizenship in a democracy, and for the work that we think states must do. I'll say this because in order to arrive at the conclusion that our constitution preserves the right to privacy, we've had to commit to some basic premises about what the constitution is for, and what our place as rights bearers within that scheme really is. And I think a good way to explain what the 9 judges in Puttaswamy did is to say that this is the exercise that they undertook. So then to start, let me just preface this by saying I'll discuss autonomy and dignity a little bit, and the way that I connect them is not necessarily the way in which others do. There are many very rich ways in which to do this. But so the first idea then that I think we get about the architecture of the Constitution from Puttaswamy is that the individual is the unit of constitutional concern. Apar will find this familiar. I complain about how this is one of the most important things Puttaswamy says for all of our rights. We've dabbled in arguing the point a little bit in the context of the data protection legislation. But what it comes from is this sense that the Constitution exists to preserve your interests and my interests above all other interests. And you'll find this in Justice Chandrachud's Puttaswamy. So he speaks for 4 of the 9 judges expressly in that case, though I think that from reading the other opinions, you'll get the sense that none of the judges on that bench would disagree. The second thought is that our Constitution makes a very clear commitment to honoring personal autonomy. And by personal autonomy, I just mean the idea that everyone has the capacity to determine how we want to live our lives, to choose the ends that we think are valuable and worth pursuing, and to really have the space in which to play out those determinations and those choices. Let's understand where this idea comes from a little more clearly. The interesting thing about Puttaswamy is that a lot of the opinions, or all of them, will lean on the idea of dignity, the idea that all humans, all men and women, without exception, are bearers of dignity. By this, we just mean that all people are naturally deserving of respect, and that the Constitution's work is to create the frameworks by which we can show that respect through the state, and by which the innate worth that we see all people as having can be protected. Among the ways that I think the Constitution puts itself to work on protecting dignity is by situating privacy at the center of all of our rights. And it does this by bringing autonomy to the fore. You'll find in Bobde's opinion that there is actually one of the 9 judges who ventures a definition, who hazards a guess at what the right to privacy might be. And this is quite a brave attempt in the context of that case, because a big chunk of the argument from the respondents there was whether the right was capable of definition at all. He tells us that the right to privacy is the right to choose and to specify. And I think that this is a very useful and fruitful way to explain privacy. If you look back at cases before Puttaswamy, you'll find that a lot of cases speak the language of privacy when you understand it in this sense. A good example might be the Nalsa case, where Articles 19 and 21, the Supreme Court says, protect the right to gender identity and your expression of that identity. And of course, after Puttaswamy, you see that privacy understood as autonomy is what informs how the court thinks through living wills, through Section 377, through adultery, and there'll be no doubt a host of other examples that we can give here. But the idea of privacy as the right to choose and specify is particularly powerful when we're thinking about informational privacy conversations. And that's because it allows us to ground data protection legislation and the whole of the debate around what form that law should take in Article 21. And the bridge by which you connect data protection law to the Constitution is by a strong and meaningful opportunity to consent. We can think more about the idea of consent perhaps in the questions a little bit. And before we get into data protection Article 21 a little more closely, I have 2 more thoughts about the architecture of the Constitution that we can get out of Puttaswamy. The first is again from Bobde. It's the idea that privacy is the right on which all others depend. In his words, he says, the basic irreducible condition necessary for the exercise of personal liberty and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution is the right to privacy. So let's tease this out a little bit. we already know the Supreme Court has held that all our rights are interconnected. But what the use of this idea of privacy as a basic irreducible condition for freedoms is that it gives us a concrete way, one concrete way at least, to think about what the connections between the rights may be. And again, the bridge by which we can see privacy is connected to every other right, and certainly, at least very obviously, to all of the rights under Article 19(1), for example, is the idea of the chilling effect. The idea is a very, very simple, intuitive idea, but it's been difficult to put to work in the courtroom. The idea is just that if we're in fear of being watched or of punishment following us when we exercise any of those 19(1) freedoms, then we end up with a right that's quite anemic and emaciated in practice. So, for example, if there's no private sphere in which we can speak with absolute freedom, we lose the room in which to test our ideas and to make up our minds about what's right and what's not. And then what happens is that our whole conception of 19(1)(a) as the engine for democracy through deliberation and debate collapses. So it's the spirit of Puttaswamy that with privacy we get the freedom to reflect, to think, to grow, to make democracy meaningful. And again, in terms of this internal aspect of exercising our expressive freedoms, we have language from Bobde's opinion we can use. The language is of cognitive freedom, the freedom to think before we act or to think alone. And the final organizing idea in part 3 that I want to dwell on is the idea that what rights we are guaranteed are rights which must be effective rights, not just rights in name. So the Puttaswamy court is agreed that the privacy right has two faces. The duty of the state is not only non-interference, but it's also to create the conditions in which we can enjoy the right in a meaningful way. And another way to put this is to say that there are negative obligations as well as positive obligations that accrue in relation to the right to privacy. This is important because conventionally, when we look at part 3 rights, we only think about the negative face of the right. That is to say that when the state forbears from interfering with our freedoms, it's sufficient for us to enjoy our freedoms, that there's nothing else that's required. But we know in practice that that's obviously not true. Again, for an example from the right to speak, if you have no access to the mediums by which you will discuss and debate important issues, you're locked out from the newspaper columns, from the TV stations, and from the internet generally, you effectively have no right to speak, though it exists on paper. There are two important notes I wanted to make on this point. And the first, and both are in relation to informational privacy / data protection, right? The first is that privacy not only requires data protection legislation, because the state is under a duty to protect informational privacy, but also that Puttaswamy privacy now requires, it makes qualitative demands on the kind of law that we ought to have. And the other point that I wanted to make, the other note, is that data protection is not the same, or giving us a data protection law is not the same as realizing a right to informational privacy. We must demand, therefore, a data protection law that maximizes our right to privacy in the sense of our right to choose and to specify. But even assuming that we get that data protection law, that is perfectly considerate of citizens and of our interests under the Constitution and true to Puttaswamy, we can and should demand more from the state in order that the right is more fully realized and more meaningful to us as technology unravels. So data protection then this law will only be the first step. So that's what I wanted to tell you on the first limb of what I wanted to address today. And on the second limb, let's begin with what the consequences of Puttaswamy have been. And I think one of the most heartening consequences of Puttaswamy is that most people take seriously that we're being called on to think about for the exercises of our constitutional freedoms and for the connection between databases and democracy more broadly. With Aadhaar, the argument is now more easily made, it's less abstract, that the database can, I go so far as to say, reconfigure the citizen-state relation in India to the extent that it would invert it entirely. So in other words, rather than individuals being the units of constitutional concern and being entitled to respect and regard from the state, and having a broad freedom of mind in the way that we've just discussed, it's the state's interests, whether it's convenience, national security, or some other end, that may become the primary focus if we're not paying careful attention to how databasing works. The database in the Aadhaar case, of course, was the Central Identities Data Repository, that's CIDR. And that was, of course, a national biometric database of identities, which was supposed to visibilize and duplicate the identities of the poorest and most vulnerable Indians. Now, to that end, CIDR's power, we were told by its proponents, is that it would aggregate a wide range of demographic and biometric information about us, right? So fingerprints, iris scans, perhaps imminently DNA and facial recognition profiles, and make all this retrievable against an Aadhaar number. I've already said that the first real sense that constitutional law is going to be rejigged by what the new technology does came from Aadhaar. And I think that this is a good example of how. Essentially what it amounts to is that databases are repositories of power that's collected from us, and that they are fully capable of being directed against us. So to be clear, I'm not saying that databasing is evil, but rather that databasing is not neutral in its effect on Part 3 rights. The dangers in databasing, really, I think, and the main danger comes from the scale and ease with which we can now combine data. These two things have given rise to what we're calling data aggregation. You'll find a very useful discussion of that idea in a 2006 Law Review article by Daniel Solov called The Taxonomy of Privacy. A staple, I think, if you're embarking on any thinking about informational privacy. But essentially, aggregation is the idea that you bring the computational power of the kinds of technology we have now together with the practice of combining one piece of data or one database with another in order to build pictures that may not, that the person giving over that data could never have foreseen you being able to see. And so aggregation makes data revelatory in a way that each individual unit was not before the aggregation took place. The reason that we need to be alive to data aggregation and its effects is captured again in that definition we have of what privacy means. If we want privacy to be the right to choose and to specify, we have to be able to demand specific consent. And it's only when the consent is specific in relation to when data is taken from us and used that we will be able to say that there's a Puttaswamy compliant regime in place. As aggregation becomes more the norm, this sort of ideal of specific and meaningful consent becomes more and more difficult to realize. If there's one thing, I'll just end here. If there's one thing that I'd like you all to take away today, it's that informational privacy is a very, very young right, relative to, say, the right to religion, the right to speak, the right against unlawful restraint. It's been articulated for India, at least, with some clarity only in very, very recent times. It's also not expressly enumerated in the Constitution. So that shadow that we had in the Puttaswamy case of the whole of the right being called into question continues to be with us now. Because we have a right that's so young and that is not expressly enumerated, we are still fighting to ensure that the core of the right remains vital and alive and meaningful. We'll have to work on setting these boundaries down, and one of the very important ways in which that will happen is through something that Apar's already discussed a little bit, and that's through ensuring that we pin down standards of review that don't eat away into the right to a degree that makes it, that really dissolves the promise that Puttaswamy still has for us. And also, in addition, I just wanted to remind you all that the Puttaswamy case and thinking conceptually about privacy is not just a way in which to deal with the current battles of the databases, of the surveillance, of the censorship that follows surveillance, and so on, but also to think more broadly about what it is that we ask for in terms of having an India that's deserving of the kind of constitution we have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your opinions in such a simplified manner. And one of the things that you talked about was consent and meaningful consent. And as we're aware that the Personal Data Protection Bill of 2019, it also looks at a consent-based framework for extracting data from individuals. So what problems do you think arise due to such a consent-based framework? And is it practical to have it in the present scenario?
That's a difficult question, but it's also an important one. Look, there's no better way. It's like with what we say of democracy, right? We don't have a better version of doing the relation between the state and citizens than democracy. We have no better way of putting the right to privacy to work, and setting boundaries around how much invasion into that right we can have, other than consent. It's difficult to put into practice, and I think that the privacy, the data protection bill we have now incorporates quite a good definition of consent that in fact draws from work that was convened by Apar and a number of others, who put out a citizens, if you will, data privacy bill. And you'll find that the definition there for consent is what has traveled into the data protection proposal now. And so just to digress a little bit, that shows you that if you engage with the process, you can see small and incremental results. I think that this is the best version of what privacy means that we've had until now in the bill. But yes, privacy doesn't answer, consent doesn't answer, at least our way of working consent doesn't answer to all of the new developments we have in technology now. And I'm sure Apar can give particular examples as well.
Right. Thank you for that answer, ma'am. So if you have any insights to provide on the consent-based framework that the data protection bill takes, and also about what, in your opinion, should a legal framework be like in order to balance privacy as well as technological development?
So there are three things to this. The first is the concept of consent by itself, where consent needs to work towards an informational asymmetry which exists in human cognition, to essentially foresee the level of activity, the scope and range of it, on the basis of which we are making that agreement, right? And we don't see it. We don't know what's it going to tangibly look in terms of what's happening at the back end, how the kitchen works, probably. So that's a tough one. I don't know how to deal with it. And if you look at possibly the first book on consent, it arises in the patient and medical practitioner context. And I've read it with some interest, and it speaks towards creation of forms, physicians and doctors explaining us, but do you notice something? The handwriting of their prescriptions still remains awful. So it won't be perfect. I want a certain degree of humility to be accounted by legal design for human cognition, given that we are imperfect. And that imperfection becomes much greater when the person is A, not a lawyer, B, quite possibly not literate or aware. Secondly, even if literate and aware, not politically active. So it needs to account for these difficulties. Second, the issue is that if you look at the bill, it approaches the solutions towards this problem with a financial industry model of what it calls as data fiduciaries, consent aggregators, rating agencies. And this is just one question I'd like to put. How well has the financial regulation industry worked towards our benefit in the past? I'm intentionally pausing because I want people to think about this. The third is the exemptions under the data protection bill, which give a large amount of maneuver to actually not seek consent prior to which information is gathered, even under ordinary conditions under which it should be gathered. And these are not conditions for surveillance reform, because the data protection bill is not looking at surveillance reform. It's only looking at categories where information is consensually gathered by people. Even then, the Sri Krishna committee draft by itself is saying that you can exempt a government department by itself rather than a specific activity. With these three critiques, I'll stop here because it falls to, I think so, much more debate, understanding, and work which needs to be shared by all of us. Quite possibly the participants who will work on better versions of the data protection bill in decades to come.
Right. Taking cue from what Mr. Gupta just pointed out, ma'am, do you think that the right to privacy then should be absolute in nature? Like you pointed out Justice Bobde's opinion, wherein he says that privacy is a right on which all others depend. And we also know that the data protection bill grants a lot of exemptions to the state to get access to personal data. So in that context, do you think the right should in itself be absolute in nature?
Again, you ask a question to which I wish I didn't have to answer, because it's every critique of the right to privacy begins with saying, oh, you know, what are its boundaries, etc. But even more than that, every sort of attempt to restrict a right, at least in Indian constitutional adjudication, and particularly privacy and free speech, begins with the statement that no right is absolute. And therefore, of course, it follows we can restrict it. And just to plug the importance of standards of review there, the bridge to how much you can restrict is not something that we engage with always or to the degree that one would like in our decisions. But I don't think that any right, I mean, would I like absolute rights in certain contexts? Certainly, but I don't think that it would be fair to say that the right to privacy ought to be an absolute right. However, there are certain spheres in which you want to see that right. You want to see that the burden on the state or whichever actor it is that is intruding into that right is very, very high, the justificatory burden. One of those examples that we could think about is when you're thinking about, you know, this cognitive freedom business, your right to think. When I'm just thinking, when there is no harm to others, and this idea of harm will go back as far as Mill and his On Liberty, which is again a text that you guys should read in college, and it's the funnest time to read it. So if there is no harm, there is no justification to restrict. And again, I think the problem is more that in India and in most other places, we have restrictions that creep. So the problem is not that privacy is not absolute. It's that people don't see it as fundamental. People don't see any of our rights as fundamental anymore, but rather will emphasize the restrictions, right? So there is a judgment of Justice Vivian Bose dissenting in a preventive detention case in the 1950s, where I think someone was detained for making a speech, or because he would make more speeches. At any event, he said very clearly that our rights are fundamental and the restrictions are not. And what I worry about is that for privacy and for most of our expressive freedoms, the inverse is what we're seeing become the norm now.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Then there's another question of what happens to the data that has already been collected by state agencies. As in, before the data protection bill, what about the data that has already been collected and is still being collected? I mean, do we have any legal framework to ensure privacy of such data currently?
So data protection law concerns not only how you collect data and what you tell the person to whom that data relates when you collect that data, but it also concerns how you will use that data, right? So for data that's already collected, one is still able to demand of the state very, very clear and specific sort of answers when we ask how this data will be used. And one is entitled to test whether those answers are fair or unfair and to reason about them. At bottom, really, all rights reasoning comes down to this, right? It's putting the state to the burden of having to explain why it's doing what it's doing. And again, we're thinking about these inversions of whether the right is fundamental or the restriction. We come back to that same point of this. It's the state's duty to reason. It's the state's duty to remember that the right is fundamental. When the data is already held by the state, we must have a clear list of what purposes that data will be used for, in what context we can complain about the misuse of that data. We should be entitled to see how much data there is, what the quality of that data is, and if possible, to the widest extent possible, we should be able to withdraw data that they've already got on us if we don't want the state to continue to hold it.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. And this is one question that I'd like to ask Mr. Gupta about. We recently came to know that the Internet Freedom Foundation has filed an RTI regarding states' backdoor access to end-to-end encrypted information from technological companies and social media platforms. So, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about how end-to-end encryption protects our privacy and how states' interference in such a framework would then hinder privacy?
There are two forms of generally broad-based encryption which are useful for telecommunications. The first is encryption during transmission, essentially that the message and the envelope, when it's in post, the postman can't open, or the post person can't open it and read it. And the second is that data at rest, essentially that when the letter is kept on a desk, that somebody can't open it and you have the key to it. Okay, so this is how encryption actually helps you, right? And it's a preserving technology not only for communication, it's used very widely for credit and debit card transactions. All financial frameworks use it. It keeps you safe, it keeps you secure. It's not only used by people who are outside the boundaries of law or trying to threaten our country. It's used by all of us. It's even used by people who don't recognize that it's being used by. So what governments have been all over the world been consistently pushing towards are using two frameworks of arguments towards what they want as backdoors, okay? Or why they say secret keys or other ways of circumvention, because they say that we're completely blind, okay? And we need a level of insight to either augment state security or to deal with the tremendous evil or child sexual abuse materials. Now, a recent instance of this is a joint statement by several countries in which India has also been a signatory. And what we have put forward in that RTI is, first, which ministry has signed on to it, given that there's no ministerial which is signified assent towards that statement, which is in contrast to how other countries have signed it. So is it the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Is it the Ministry of Home Affairs? Is it the Ministry of Electronics and IT? And whether all of them have been consulted. That's one, given pending litigations in the Supreme Court. The second is, have you sought legal opinion prior to doing it? So is it consistent with the Puttaswamy judgment? And this is how administrative frameworks and governance needs to function, right? You secure a legal opinion because you're a public authority exercising powers vested by the Constitution of India, right? You're not a king, a feudal lord. You're essentially working within a design of ensuring governance. And the third, which we have asked, is that is there any plan on introducing any legislation which is pending right now with the ministry? Is it in a drafting process? We've put this towards fulfilling the element of transparency. But if you look at the 2009 rules, which I did remark upon, it does have the power of issuing directions by the central government or the state government, even for forcing decryption in certain conditions. Again, those conditions go back to the same structural problems and incentives I've indicated earlier. I would just like to mention there are a large amount of questions which focus on the politics of the present environment and moment. And I would not be honest if I don't address them. And my hope and optimism, why it does seem so misplaced. I would just like to say my hope and optimism does not come because the environment is so conducive. My hope and optimism comes because there is an increased level of sensitivity in young people in which they know that the situation right now requires principled constitutionalism. It comes from people who are looking at things with a high degree of sensitivity and know that they, as young lawyers, need to engage with it with a deal of seriousness. And if we don't maintain this hope and vision of constitutionalism, we don't work towards it then. And this is why I'm saying it may seem like a futile effort, but incrementally over a period of time, it all adds up for the better.
Certainly, sir. And we can see more and more young students and people being interested in digital rights advocacy due to the work of people like you and Ms. Uppaluri and others, of course. And when you talked about consultation with, legal people in the field and consultation with lawyers, I mean, do you think that the way in which lawmaking, the selection committees, the parliamentary committees or the select committees, the way in which they are formed and the composition of such committees has to be reformed in order to have more citizen-centric laws than state-centric laws?
Very quickly on that, I'm not an expert. People from PRS legislative may be better equipped to comment on it. I think there are people such as Mandara Kala and Chakshu Roy who have extensively written upon it in op-eds in Hindu Indian Express, and I would encourage people to look at it. I have a high degree of respect for our lawmakers. I think they're incredibly disciplined. We have fantastic amounts of skill, talent, and discipline. They do take forward issues of their constituency. What we have historically lacked is a degree of respect, engagement, and institutional support for them towards rewarding good behavior and better outcomes. I do think Parliament is a very important institution and we need to focus on it more and more. Much more towards the specificity of your question, all the committee compositions are distinct and they operate under distinct rules also. A standing and a joint parliamentary committee are fairly different and there's a high level of discretion as well. But these are matters which will require another seminar by itself, probably by experts who are much more suited towards commenting on it.
Thank you, sir. I'll just pose one last question to Ms. Uppaluri. And that's about state surveillance in the guise of national security. Could you comment a little on how state surveillance is furthered through our privacy statute rather than it being shielding us from such surveillance?
Very, very generally, I think the problem is in the kinds of language we use to express what type of interest the state is driving at, right, to surveil. So because of the breadth, the really elastic nature of national security, of public order, it becomes again that the restriction creeps and then the right constricts. right? Because it's very difficult for you to argue with somebody who says, oh, the life of the nation is at stake if you don't give over this piece of your data, or let me watch this one man for this 1 week. But what we really need in order for the surveillance conversation to lean less in favor of the state, I won't say more in favor of privacy because we're nowhere near there yet, is for us to call on the state to be more specific about what kinds of interests it is seeking to protect and why. Very often it's enough for the state to say, oh, you know, national security or public order, and a court will ordinarily defer. That deference needs to stop, or at least it needs to become less common than it is now in cases involving surveillance, I think.
All right. Thank you so much to the both of you for joining in today and for engaging with us on such a significant topic. And I'm sure that everyone who has attended this session has taken away a lot. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll be sharing the recording on our YouTube channel, and I'll share them personally with you as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a pleasant weekend, everyone. Bye bye.